Hi everyone. Good evening, welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's session. My name is Swapnil and I'm your host for the day. Today we will talk about how leaders can create a culture of well-being and flexibility in a new era of work. This will cover exclusive insights on what employees in India want when designing a flexible employee experience program, and how you can use Qualtrics solution to meet the needs and expectations of your team. Well, our speakers will cover uh, will speak more about this. So let me introduce and welcome our speakers for today. We have Lauren. Lauren is the Employee Experience Solution Strategist for Qualtrics for Southeast Asia, and Greater China. She is a highly experienced organizational psychologist with more than 13 years of experience in working with C-suite and senior management across industry to enable their human capital strategies. Lauren has a deep expertise in the intersection between human capital and technology, with a specialty in employee experience, talent management, organizational design, and change management during digital transformation. She holds 2 master degrees, a first in organizational psychology and a second in innovation study. We then have Mr. Pawan Shetty. Pawan is currently responsible for the mid-market business across the India region for Blueprint Technology. He comes with 10 years of experience in sales and business development and is involved in some key customer engagement for Blueprint. Before joining Blueprint, he was with a venture-funded startup in the clean energy and technology space. Before we start with today's session, if you have any questions, please feel to put them in the Q&A window and we will address it during the Q&A part. So without further ado, I will request Lauren to start with today's session. Over to you, Lauren.
Great. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I'm looking forward to discussing with everyone today this really important topic that I think is close to our hearts, both as human capital practitioners and as employees ourselves, thinking about these topics of flexibility and of well-being. So I'm going to share a couple of insights with you today. So if you give me a moment, I'm going to be sharing my screen. I'm going to be talking through this topic in 3 key parts. So I'm going to be talking a bit about how some of these work preferences are evolving across APJ and in India specifically. I'm going to be talking about how we can deepen some of that listening around well-being if we really want it to be a strategic priority within our organization. So what are some of those key drivers that we want to be looking out for? And then just talking about how can we connect some of that with existing data in our employee experience programs to really elevate the level of insight that we have into employee sentiment across the board. I'll be closing out today with a couple of key takeaways. So these might be considerations for yourself and your own organization in your 2023 workforce planning. Now, as we go along, please do feel free to contribute comments in the chat or raise questions, as we will have some good time towards the end of today's session for Pavan and myself to answer those questions. So let's start by putting some of these findings in context. Now, as an organizational psychologist, the past few years have been both exciting and intimidating in the sense that we've seen far more radical changes in some of our workplace policies than have ever been seen in the past. So discussions around digitization were rapidly advanced. Discussions around flexible work have really now come to the fore. So we're seeing more and more experimentation when it comes to a number of these different practices. And certainly we are learning in that process, and that's part of what we're going to see through some of the findings today, which is that there isn't really one silver bullet solution when it comes to what employees are looking for. What we're really seeing is that this change is facilitating the need for far more hyper-personalization in employee experience. So what are a couple of the key trends that we've seen? Now, this was a letter that was penned at Qualtrics some time ago on the basis of feedback that we got across over 22,000 individuals across the globe. There are a couple of things that came through really strongly. So the first is that leaders need to be able to deal with how employee expectations have evolved. So we know that in India, for example, levels of employee engagement are at an all-time high, around 84%. But we also know that intention to stay is becoming more and more worrying, with only around 62% of individuals committed to stay with their organization for the longer term. We also know that when we ask employees outright if their overall experience of working for their organization meets their expectations, less than half of people agree. So that bar that employees are setting for their leaders and for their organizations is getting higher and higher. The second key theme we heard from employees across the globe is that they want a workplace that's designed around their needs. So there is this need for hybrid working and really finding out how we can keep some of those cultural elements alive, even with having some of this work becoming more digital. The third key imperative we saw was we want more of a commitment around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So actions and not words. And then the final one, which is part of what we'll be discussing in a lot more detail today, is that mental health and well-being support is a non-negotiable. So organizations really need to start thinking about this as a KPI or as an outcome that they hold themselves accountable for, the way that they've been holding themselves accountable for things like employee engagement to date. So let's have a look at, give me a moment to return to these slides. Give me a moment. Can I just confirm that my slides are not being shared at the moment?
Yeah, Lauren, I mean, the slides are not being shared. Yeah.
Okay, right. Let me just find out what's happened there and give me a moment. Okay. Right. I will reshare and just let me know when those are up again.
Yeah, we can see them.
Perfect. Right. So let's start off with a question for everyone. So in the chat, it would be great if you could put in your thoughts here around what do you think that people would prefer? And for yourself, would you prefer a 4-day working week or would you prefer greater flexibility? So really interested to hear your thoughts on this. And recently, I ran a series of webinars across multiple countries, reflecting on some of their findings, particularly in this aspect. And overall, we saw some really interesting things. So while you reflect and put your thoughts in the chat, I'll just start by defining, what is it that we really mean by flexibility? So there are a couple of different elements. The first is being able to work a predetermined number of hours. The second is being able to choose the hours and the days that you do work. The third is the flexibility to be able to run errands or go to doctor's appointments during the day. And the final one, the flexibility to be able to work from any location. So let's start by looking at the findings across Asia Pacific and Japan for starters. So we saw overwhelmingly that there was far more of a preference, around 60% of people choosing flexibility over the 4-day work week. Now, there's still a lot of popularity about this concept of the 4-day work week. So what is it that employees are thinking while they're weighing up the pros and cons of this potential new way of working? Well, let's look at some of the top perceived pros across Asia Pacific and Japan, represented there in blue, as well as the findings here in India. So we can see that the top 3 benefits that employees anticipate from a 4-day work week would be an improvement in their work-life balance, the capacity to make them more productive, and an improvement in their mental well-being. We also see from these particular findings that employees in India are even a bit more enthusiastic about the positive potential implications of the 4-day work week. But employees are also concerned about some of the cons. And what is surprising about this is a number of these cons are the same types of concerns that our executive teams and managers and business leaders may have. So employees are concerned that a 4-day work week would actually just mean working a lot, many longer hours and days to make up for that lost time. They're concerned that this might have a negative impact on sales and revenue goals, and they're also concerned that this might frustrate some of their customers and clients. And those findings are echoed or are quite similar across India as well. So in India itself, we saw a very similar trend to APJ, with 62% of employees preferring flexibility and 38% preferring a 4-day work week. Now, where are a lot of these concerns stemming from? So when we looked at some of the potential or the problems that we're trying to solve for with the 4-day work week, a lot of that came down to the ability to be truly productive in those work hours. So the ability to take proper time off to recharge and rest. We also saw that the capacity to be able to spend proper time outside of work, so really getting some of that work-life balance is part of what seems to be driving this trend. Now we know that during pandemic times, what a lot of organizations did was they gave employees, say, a recharge day or a day off, because we know that while well-being has maintained quite well, a lot of the resilience factors of employees are starting to get undermined. But simply giving that day off didn't often solve for the fundamental problem. Because even if I take the Friday off and I arrive back on Monday to the 1,249 unanswered emails, that effect on my well-being can actually be compounded rather than solved. So employees are really asking for this flexibility with this mindfulness that something fundamental has got to shift in the nature of work and the nature of work design in order to make this arrangement feasible. So let's have a little bit of a deeper dive around flexibility and its relationship with well-being. So first we asked, what does flexibility mean to you for our sample in India? And 35% said flexibility meant it's the hours that they work, 20% said it's where they work, 22% said it's the days that they work, and 14% said it would be success based on performance only, so not on time spent. Now, all of these things are being asked for to solve for this challenge of well-being. And there's a headline finding here that I'd really like to call out, which is that 79% of employees across India identified their job as the main source of their mental health challenges. Now, that is a deeply concerning figure and something we should be thinking very seriously about as organizations, particularly as organizations are starting to commit to strategic well-being as an imperative and a pillar of their HR strategies going forward. Now, if we wanted to understand a little more around well-being within our workforce, a good starting point might be to do a really purposeful pulse around this. So most organizations already have in place some form of listening program that gets a sense of sentiment on the ground from pre-hire through to retire. So many organizations have already done that exercise of creating various employee personas, mapping out that employee journey and identifying or surfacing some of these moments that matter. Now, we know that in addition to this, there's often employee studies that are very necessary for us to get to the root cause of a particular issue. So if we know that around 79% of employees are saying that their job is undermining their well-being, then we need to understand what are some of those drivers that are impacting this. Now, at Qualtrics, in our XM Institute, which is an organization that is dedicated to research in the experience space, there are teams of organizational psychologists like myself and data scientists looking at best practices and methodologies for a number of different types of employee studies, including well-being. A recent piece of research that they conducted suggested that well-being is a composite factor with 3 components. So it's about whether or not someone feels energized in the work that they do, whether they feel positive about themselves, and whether they have trusting relationships. So all 3 of these in combination can really make up this well-being KPI. And out of the 3, we found that feeling energized was actually the most predictive of a number of outcomes, including things like employee engagement, intention to stay, and overall satisfaction with the experience of working at your organization. So if you are thinking of including well-being as a important driver or KPI, these are some of the elements that it constitutes of, and you should be thinking about. Now, if we want to be able to improve on this over time, so be able to build up our employees' sense of well-being, then there are 4 areas of drivers that we can work on. So the first is around alignment. So does the individual feel that commonality between themselves, their role, and the organization? So a lot of this has to do with this feeling of being in flow. So is the individual well suited to their role? Does it make the most of their capabilities? So does it create some of that healthy stretch without it being too far or too burdensome? Is it also of sufficient interest to them that they feel energized to keep returning to that role over time? From a company perspective, do they feel well aligned with the organizational values? And do they feel that the values are not just something on the wall, but something that are really lived and breathed by their team, by their manager, and by the organization as a whole? So alignment is a big area that we can spend some time really deep diving and understanding with our employees. The next major area or driver of well-being is around support. So does the organization give the type of support that is needed? And that might be some of the hygiene type of factors. So things like access to insurances around healthcare, for example, time off for parental leave. So these could be a number of policy-driven aspects, but this could also be support from the team themselves or from the manager, particularly during challenging times and during times of change, where we know, for example, that employees really need our leaders to step up and communicate more so that they get a sense of direction and a sense of feedback, even when things are a bit tumultuous. The third area that we can think a lot about if we want to impact positively on well-being is around how can we build up resilience? So we know that a lot of these resilience factors have really been worn down over the past few years. So employees are feeling somewhat change fatigued, having gone through all of those experiences during the pandemic, having to adapt to going fully online, going hybrid, needing to return to the office and so forth. So a lot of those changes have felt, quite unnatural for a number of people. And so we need to think about ways that we can recharge them or make sure that they feel that they have those personal resources to cope with some of the job pressures that might be coming. As many organizations now, post-pandemic, might be looking to bulk up or go into a growth mode, or potentially they might be looking to change some of their business models. The fourth area that we can influence around well-being is around balance. So making sure that the workload is manageable and the tasks can actually be finished within working hours. What we saw in the previous findings from the recent study is that this was one of the biggest concerns when it came to the 4-day work week, is that just simply condensing the number of days would not necessarily reduce the number of hours. And so overall might actually undermine well-being. So if you're thinking about having a conversation with your employees, you should be thinking about all 4 of these areas and really diagnosing what it is that your employees need. Now, a singular pulse alone is not necessarily going to solve for this challenge of well-being. We need to think of a multi-touch program across the employee lifecycle, where as soon as there is any significant event or topic of interest, that employees are able to voice up their feedback in a structured way. So we can think about that right from before the employee even joins the organization. So what was their experience as a candidate? What was their experience during onboarding? How did they feel about their learning and development opportunities? What was some of their sentiment after they had performance or career conversations? How were they supported when they potentially got a promotion or there was some internal mobility? How was their experience of returning from parental leave? What is their experience of their technology within the organization? And what is some of the sentiment that they want to pass on to the organization when they leave? So organizations that are really committed to employee experience are really thinking about having multiple different channels where employees can give this feedback. And in doing so, they really want to create this connected view. And where that is powerful is, say, for example, we wanted to introduce something like the 4-day work week. Well, actually, this really hits around this concept of internal mobility. So 80% of employees in India felt that flexibility would negatively affect their advancement or pay. So even if with the best intentions, we think about solving for well-being by introducing something like a 4-day work week, that might have an unintended negative consequence somewhere else across the employee lifecycle. So we might pick this up in feedback around mobility or feedback around performance management, where individuals might feel that their managers are not well equipped to be able to recognize what performance looks like outside of time-based performance. So many legacy management styles are very much based on how much face time they see with that employee, or how many hours that employee is dedicating to their particular role. So it takes a far greater skill set for managers to be able to not just manage in this hybrid world, but also manage by outcomes rather than time. And it's really only when we've got our managers and our leaders to build out this capability that we could think of introducing some of these programs while still allaying some of the concerns that our employees have about the impact that this could have on other parts or on other aspects of their career advancement. Now, if we're solving for well-being, there are probably a number of different things or different points of data that we would want to be able to stitch together. So when we're trying to solve for something like why are employees leaving our organizations due to burnout, we might find that the answer to that comes at several different points. So there might be some hints of information in our well-being pulse, there might be some hints of information in our parental leave pulse, or even elsewhere across the employee journey. So what we have seen in organizations across the board is them enhancing the level of analytics that they're doing in the experience space. So many organizations are doing relatively basic analytics. So just looking at where are their particular drivers, where scores are high or scores are low. But these are all relative. So the next level of analytics is actually to be able to look at these drivers and how they correlate with outcomes like well-being. Being able to explore these results dynamically and real time using different visualizations, whether that is plotted charts or whether that is heat maps. So that's the next stage of evolution. But the stage of evolution after that is then to really be able to stitch together these various data sets to be able to solve for complex issues like attrition. So let me walk you through a real example of this. So what you can see playing out in the small video on screen is an example of a real-time dashboard from Qualtrics. So this is a customer organization that has a number of different touch points in which they gather employee data from pre-hire through to retire. In this particular example, they have stitched together the data from onboarding, which they collect at 30, 60, and 90 days, with some of their engagement pulsing results. So it starts with some overall headlines there, where you can get a sense around the positive, neutral, and negative sentiment when it comes to each of these. So some of those headline findings. From there, what the platform is then able to do is have a look across what are some of the drivers that are most impacting these two headlines. So which are the items that correlate most strongly? So which onboarding experiences most closely linked to engagement? And you can see that the most impactful item there is how interesting do you find your role with this company? There's also important items there like, have you been introduced to all of your team members or everyone you will be working closely with within the first week? So sometimes having some of that type of information can really be helpful, because if you're looking for what are those elements within onboarding that we can change that are going to help not just give us a better perception of overall onboarding, but also help with engagement down the line, then you can look at the top factors. It's also helped a number of our customer organizations to make a case back to their executive teams where they might have wanted to get some investment or some funds for radically redesigning the onboarding processes. So we know that onboarding has certainly been a pain point in the past few years. And while a lot of innovative technologies and new approaches have been introduced, it's still largely experimental, with individuals who are more remote or hybrid having very different experiences to those that have been onboarded in person. What was also interesting from our recent EX trends is we saw that individuals who joined organizations over the past 3 years, so pandemic onwards, had less of a sense of belonging and inclusion with their organizations, and they identified less with them. So many organizations are thinking about almost doing not just an onboarding for new employees, but a re-onboarding for those that joined during pandemic times, to make sure that they really do feel a more coherent part of the organization. Now, of course, what we've discussed so far is some headlines and some broad stroke findings. But what you can see towards the end of this visualization is the importance then of slicing and dicing this data across multiple different factors, whether that is by geography, whether that is by department, or whether that's by demographic factors like gender or generation. This might help surface very particular segments of our organization where the onboarding and engagement relationship is not looking as positive. Some of these needle in a haystack findings will be really important for us to have, because as organizations, we want to be able to celebrate some pockets of excellence that we have across our organizations, but we also want to be able to identify some of those pockets of discontent so that we can lean in heavily and take action in finding and fixing some of those experience gaps. This is also an opportunity if we are thinking about creating a differentiated employer brand, for us to think about how we can create breakthrough experiences. So because we know that onboarding, for example, is becoming or is being radically redesigned, it's a great opportunity for this to potentially be a differentiator for your organization and for your brand. So I'm going to just wrap up with a couple of findings here, and then invite Pavan to join the discussion and take some questions from the audience. So please feel free to start contributing some of those questions on the chat as I walk through some of the headlines from today's discussion. So the first thing that we're really seeing from these findings is that a one-size-fits-all approach and a top-down policy is probably not the answer. So in this world of the experience economy, employees are demanding more and more personalized or hyper-personalized experiences. Employees are saying that they know what they want, and they want to be given a voice in crafting some of these new ways of working. When we asked employees if they wanted to give more regular feedback to their organizations, over 90% of employees agreed. We saw that over 64% of organizations across the globe ramped up their capability for employee listening over the past few years. But we also know that only 34% of organizations take good or great action on the basis of this feedback. So employees are demanding not just a voice, but also that their voice is heard and that something happens on the basis of that feedback. So importantly, we need to really think about crafting out meaningful and impactful employee experience strategies. The second key takeaway is that there really are some unprecedented experiments underway. So these discussions of things like unlimited leave or the 4-day work week or radically reinventing onboarding. Now, what we want to sort of take away from today's discussion is that there might be some negative unintended consequences of these of some of these experiments. So it's important that we think about a balanced scorecard of outcomes that we are consistently measuring across the employee life cycle, so that we really understand how some of these new experiments are landing with our employees. So when I talk about a balanced scorecard of outcomes, I'd encourage you to think about 5 different topics. So the first being employee engagement as an important and foundational construct that helps us understand whether or not employees are bringing that energy to work, whether they feel that sense of accomplishment and that sense of motivation. The second in that balanced scorecard would then be intention to stay. So while these 2 constructs used to correlate quite strongly, we're seeing that there is a significant gap in recent data. So we need to keep an eye on this as a separate construct. The third that we're seeing more and more organizations introduce is the employee experience gap. So asking employees directly, to what extent does your experience at working for this organization meet your expectations? Because what that helps us gauge is how high a bar employees are setting in terms of their expectations, so that we can know where and how we can potentially meet those, or we can be more transparent and honest with our employees where there are some of those elements that we are not going to be able to deliver due to the nature of our industry or work. And really, once we've got this balanced scorecard of outcomes, so all 3 of these, we also want to supplement that with sense of inclusion and well-being. So thinking about these as outcomes rather than drivers. Once we have these, we want to think about having a complete set of drivers that we ask about very purposefully at different points in the life cycle, so that we can drive action across a nuanced and complete set of drivers. And that's really what's going to bring about this overall improvement to well-being. So while we talked about those 4 key and critical components and contributors to well-being, there are a number of different other elements across the employee life cycle that can also help us elevate in this area. So the final lesson from today is around the distraction that some of these trends like the 4-day work week often are from some other structural issues that we need to address within organizations. So we certainly don't want to fall into that trap where we introduce something like the 4-day work week, but our employees are deeply concerned about the business performance. They're deeply concerned about the impact that this would have on their own career trajectory or even their own pay. So a key theme for us at Qualtrics during the course of this year has been the importance of really leading with empathy. So really taking very seriously what our employees are thinking, feeling, and what they are saying, and thinking about using them as a partner in creating more flexible solutions and environments. And then holding ourselves accountable for this by making well-being a KPI. And what we're seeing in a number of our customer organizations is that this balanced scorecard of outcomes is becoming a way in which we're thinking of measuring the performance of our managers and our leaders. So it shouldn't just be about, what is the revenue a particular business unit is contributing, or what is the savings they're contributing, but also what is that team's lived and breathed experience. Because only when we really elevate this as a business priority will individuals feel the freeness to actually take advantage of some of these new and flexible policies that are being put in place. So Pavan, I'm keen for you to jump on and join us and perhaps share a few thoughts on this topic from your side, while I just have a look at the chats and see what questions are coming through.
Sure, Lorraine. Thanks for the insight. I'm pretty sure the audience get a kind of global perspective of where we are in terms of, the importance or the relevance of the experience for employees, right? At least from an employee perspective. Like you said, I think one of the closing points when your slides was on being a voice for your employees. One of them that's, I think it's quite essential. In India, I think there are places where there are challenges where people or employees, do have that difficulty to express themselves. But that said, I think I think that was quite insightful for the audience, I would say. I just have a few slides, audience. I just have a few slides on Blueprint, who we are and what we do as Qualtrics is a familiar name, but Blueprint may not be for most of you. But maybe I could just walk you through. Just bear with us for a few minutes before we jump into the questions. Right? Blueprint, we are a pioneer in technology, typically in the new generation technology of SAP. We kind of we sell, implement the different cloud portfolios, Qualtrics being the mainstay. The kind of innovation which Qualtrics has brought into the experience is what kind of enhances maybe SuccessFactors or if any of the other solutions that are available in the market from an employee experience or employee kind of HR perspective, right? HR IT perspective. In Blueprint, we kind of have different LOBs. We have what is called workforce transformation. We have the enterprise transformation space, and we have the technology transformation as well, right? These are the three verticals within Blueprint. And Qualtrics falls into the gambit of the workforce transformation, wherein we kind of enhance the HRIS systems, be it SuccessFactors or what have you. We enhance the kind of usability of it and the adding to the experience which employees have. So that's why I think we felt it was a better fit to kind of have that along with SuccessFactors when we kind of reach out to customers, right? Typically, we have the backend or the ERP aspect, which has the S4HANA, then the front end for the C4C or the Cloud for Customer. And also on technology, we have the analytics on cloud offering, the BW for HANA, basically business intelligence point of view, right? So we have the entire kind of portfolio out here along with Qualtrics to kind of digitize your, let's say, workplace or your organization, so to speak, right? I'll not take kind of too much on it. I just want to kind of touch base on a little bit on our capability. While the practice has been new in Blueprint, we have a kind of consultant size of about 10 right now. Maybe I would use this opportunity to call out key customers in the Qualtrics space that we have kind of implemented for. We have customers like Altimetric, Sun Pharma, Indegene is one of the other key customers where we have implemented Qualtrics as well. We are kind of underway with certain other key customers as well because they're seeing the benefit. The HR transformation is one aspect. The kind of transformation from an employee perspective is also equally important from their experience point of view, right? That helps kind of take corrective measures. When I say corrective from an employee retention point of view, it helps take suitable corrective measures to kind of enhance their experience, understand the problems they're facing, and kind of try and fix those kind of gaps in the whole ecosystem from an HRIS perspective, right? So that's a little bit on us. I'm not going to bore you too much on what Blueprint does. It just kind of give you an insight of what all we can do. Lorraine, perhaps you could kind of open up the questions, if I may.
Sure thing. So please feel free, everyone that's joined today, to put any questions that you have on the chat about the study around workplace flexibility, or any questions that might be top of mind for you around employee experience more broadly. So Pavan, maybe while we sort of hang on, I think we've got one question that's come through. If you had to focus on one or two primary well-being offerings for your company's workforce for maximum impact, what would that be? So I think that's a great question, Shiv, that's come through. And I'm probably going to give you a slightly unpopular answer, which is I think it really is varying organization to organization. So what we saw during pandemic is most employers have really sort of doubled down on some of the wellbeing resources that they've made available to their employees. So things like wellness and flexible benefits, things like additional time off. So those have been really helpful in maintaining higher levels of well-being and rebuilding some of the resilience within the workforce. However, we've also seen that these policies have not necessarily gone far enough. So I think two of the biggest challenges that organizations are looking to solve for in the well-being space is around that balancing of workload. So how do we give that flexibility to employees that they will actually use it? Because if we have less hours to work but more work to do, there's still this sense that people are going to continue to show up and burn themselves out because they don't want to miss out on pay advancements or career advancements. So I think the big one that we're looking to solve for is around workload. And the second big one that I think organizations are looking to solve for in the well-being space is around leadership capability. So actually having leaders that can lead with empathy, which is a very specific skill set and looks quite different from how we have been managing individuals up to date. So typically the individuals that we put in leadership positions often put in those positions because, they've been very good at whatever specialist background that they came from, or they've been in the organization a long time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those empathetic skills come to them very naturally. And given that our employees in general, have really worn down some of their resilience factors, the trust with their team, the trust with their managers is becoming more and more important. So that if they are running a risk of burnout, for example, they can actually feel safe to voice that up to their manager and say to their manager, things are becoming unmanageable and I need you to be able to lean in and support me. And they want to be able to know that manager's reaction is going to be an empathetic one. So it's going to be a reaction of, I hear you, it's okay to not be okay. And this is how, as an organization, we're going to rally around to support you. And that's probably, quite a long journey potentially for some of our managers and leaders. So I think firstly, to answer your question, is probably not a one size fits all. We need to think about having those hygiene factors in place. So some of those key benefits. But then after that, there's these two main challenges that you need to think about solving in your own organization around workload and around empathy within your management layers and as well. Okay. There is another question here around how Qualtrics can help with employer branding. So another great question. So of course, employee branding is really top of mind for many organizations at the moment. Attracting talent, particularly in certain industries like tech, has become more and more troublesome. In my touring around multiple cities here in India and having multiple discussions with some very well-known names, one of the top concerns that was brought to me time and time again by CHROs has been attrition. Losing talent out there at the market and not being able to attract it in as quickly and as easily. How our employer brand is perceived out there is really critical. And, our belief at Qualtrics is the way in which you want to understand whether or not employees are feeling positive around your organization is really thinking about doing that listening from pre-hire through to retire. So thinking about, from the time that a candidate is interested in your organization, that they click on the website, that there's the opportunity there to give feedback. So did you get all the information you needed about this job? Thumbs up, thumbs down. As you're going through the job application process, having that sort of feedback ability where, this part of the application process is duplication or this button isn't working. Through the interview process, after I've gone for interviews, making sure that I can also give feedback around, was it timeliness? Was I asked appropriate questions? Did I feel that I was treated with respect during this process? So really getting all of that feedback right as an individual as a candidate? Because we know around 25% of people, so about a quarter of people, say that they have a really bad experience during that candidate process. And those individuals that have a bad experience are likely to take action on the basis of that. So they're likely to talk badly about your employer brand to their talent networks. They might write on social media, so things like LinkedIn or Glassdoor. They might stop using your products and services. So it's really important that we're giving a voice to this and making sure that we take some immediate action in that process. And when we talk about immediate action, we mean immediate action. So with Qualtrics, one of the unique things we're able to do, because we integrate seamlessly with over 100 different productivity and HRIS type of tools, is if, say, a candidate at some stage in the process gives us a negative rating, we can actually trigger a workflow directly to that talent acquisition person to get in contact with that prospective employee within 24 hours to make sure that they don't drop off the process and that negative sentiment doesn't go external. So really being able to respond to that immediately. And that needs to continue throughout the entire employee journey, because our employees are our biggest brand ambassadors out there for our employer brand. They're the ones that are talking about whether or not the organization lives and breathes the values that they might have on the wall. So consistently getting feedback across those 5 outcomes that I spoke about in the beginning. So engagement, intention to stay, an important one there being this overall experience gap. Because that overall experience gap is the difference between what I think is a great organization and brand to work for versus what I think I'm getting at this organization, so that you can really understand what that delta looks like. And not just at a headline level, really being able to deep dive, what does that mean for different employee segments? So you might feel that, overall people feel quite positive about your employer brand, but maybe there's a particular pocket of individuals. So maybe that could be your female mid-managers in certain cities that aren't having that same experience and that feel that, this isn't a brand that aligns with them. And therefore would, again, sort of take some of those same actions that a candidate might take. So really important that we're looking not just at some of those headline findings, but that we're also deep diving and, understanding what that means for different segments. So part of it is looking at the candidate experience, looking at the overall lived employee experience. And then, of course, we've also partnered with organizations that specifically want to do employer branding studies. So they want to be able to go out there and do some type of census research that is highly customized to be able to really understand how it is that prospective employees are feeling about their employer brand. And that could be for very specific segments of talent that they're trying to target in very specific geographies, or that could be far more broad-based. So there are also examples of, a number of customers that we've partnered with, particularly in this employer branding space. So 3 different elements to think about there. All of those sort of prospective employees out there in the big employer brand studies, those that are in our candidate process, but our most important employee our most important ambassadors for employee brand being our current employees, and thinking about how we are measuring that overall satisfaction with the experience across that entire employee life cycle. Okay. Feel free to contribute any more questions in the Q&A or on the chat. I think while we may be waiting for one to go through, there was something that you raised earlier, Pavan, that I wouldn't mind to address as well. You mentioned around how employees, particularly in India, might not always sort of feel so safe to voice up, and particularly to their managers, and how can we manage around that? And I think that's a great question, and it's a concern that many customers and prospective customers discuss with me on a regular basis. So when we're trying to create that culture of feedback, I think firstly we need to be realistic around what is our starting point. So some organizations are much further down that journey than others. So I work with some organizations where there is fear just to voice up feedback in an annual engagement survey. And so, we need to make that completely anonymous and confidential, and we need to really protect how that data is disseminated throughout the organization. So employees feel very safe that even a manager is getting team results. They're not going to be able to see, oh, well, Lauren gave a poor rating on this, or Lauren said that, because that might have some negative consequences for me. So usually, the starting point is around protecting that anonymity. And of course, technology can support us with that. It's also around creating some consistent channels where employees know that, for example, every time they give feedback, it's through Qualtrics. So they know that that's the official channel for feedback, and that they know that action is going to be taken on the basis of that. So making sure there's that consistent and that easy user experience, making sure that confidentiality is protected, and also using some best practice questions. So really sort of thinking carefully about, what are the drivers that are most important, and asking really powerful questions around that. We also want to make the experience for the employees simple, in the sense we do things like only have one question per page, or we typically only use sort of 5-point scales versus 10-point or 11-point scales that can be very intimidating for employees to undertake. We also want to make it easy by giving them multiple options in terms of the way in which they give feedback. So, it could be through QR codes, for example, it could be through email, it could be through Teams or other communication channels. What we've seen some organizations do is actually use Qualtrics to create always on and completely anonymous feedback that goes all the way to the CEO office. So there's quite a lot that you can do, if you're in the relative nascent stages of feedback. And then, of course, I have organizations that I work with that are on the opposite end of that extreme. So I have one example of a customer organization where what they actually want to do is give some of the pulsing data. So they do quarterly employee voice surveys, and they actually want the team themselves to see the results before the manager. so that the team can sit down and say, this is our voice, this is what's important to us. And then actually they decide to tell the manager and say, these are the things we now need on the basis of the feedback that we've provided. Of course, that has taken a very long time to get to that level of transparency, that level of empowerment. But it is certainly possible. And I think we need to be realistic that this is something that employees are wanting, and that they certainly know that if they don't get the opportunity to voice up safely at your organization, there might be another one somewhere else where they will be able to, and something will be done on the basis of that. And, that might be a compelling reason to move on or to exit the organization as well.
Sure, Lauren. I think that insight, I think, is a good insight for the audience as well, because I think that just builds and builds, and then they either kind of have a breakdown or they choose to move out of the organization they're in. So I think we end up losing them for no major reason as such. So yeah, that's a good insight. Thanks for sharing.
Okay, I don't think we've got any other questions from the audience. Any last minute questions? I think I saw a hand raised somewhere. Anuj. If we don't have any more questions, shall we wrap up and give everyone 5 minutes back for a well-being break to stretch their legs between Zoom calls?
Sure. I think thank you, Lauren. Thanks, Pawan, for leading the session today. Thanks, Blueprint team for hosting the session. And thank you very much, audience, for joining us today. Swapnil, I think we can close this session out now.
Yeah,
thank you all.
We can close the session. Just a quick poll to capture the response.
Great. So thanks everyone so much for joining. It's been a pleasure to share some of these insights. And yeah, look forward to your responses on the poll around whether or not your organization has an employee experience tool. And if you'd like us to be in touch so we can discuss a little bit more about this topic and potentially bring this to life for you with a demonstration as well.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks. Thank you, audience. Thanks so much.